We thank the listeners who have already subscribed to our channel and invite new ones to subscribe for free as well.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate the support.
Today, we have a truly fascinating historical mission. We are taking a deep dive into an extraordinary, largely forgotten chapter of geopolitical history.
It really is an incredible narrative.
And to set the stage properly,
Yeah.
we need to state right here at the very beginning that the historical analysis serving as the foundation for this deep dive is the work of historian and Professor Reuven Feingold of Hebraica of Jerusalem.
Right. Our goal today is to impartially extract the facts and insights from his research and just bring you the story exactly as the history presents it.
Exactly. So think about the establishment of a Jewish state. Naturally, your mind travels to the Middle East.
Of course.
You picture the Mediterranean coast, the historic cities, the deserts of the Levant. But what if I told you that there is a highly orchestrated attempt to build the Promised Land in the remote, freezing wilderness of Siberia?
It sounds completely fictional. I mean, it sounds like an alternate history novel, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yet this was a very real geopolitical project launched by the Soviet Union. Today, we are going to explore how and why the Kremlin attempted to create a Jewish state in the Far East.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really understand how a Siberian settlement ever became a serious proposal, we need to transport ourselves back to the turn of the 19th to the 20th century.
Right, the historical context is crucial here.
If you lived in Central or Eastern Europe at that time, anti-Semitism wasn't just a background issue. It was rampant.
Rampant and deeply structural.
Exactly. And under the Russian Tsarist regime, the Romanov dynasty, the situation for Jewish populations was exceptionally bleak.
Exceptionally bleak is putting it mildly. The Jewish population was heavily restricted. They were largely confined to specific areas, completely isolated from the sociocultural life that the local populations enjoyed.
They were essentially cut off.
Completely. The oppression was relentless. So, when a community is subjected to that level of systemic exclusion, they inevitably seek a way out. They look for practical solutions.
And one of those solutions was political radicalization.
Exactly. Significant segments of the Jewish population wanted to dismantle the dictatorial regime of the Romanovs, so they aligned themselves with the philosophies of Karl Marx.
They joined the communist and Bolshevik ranks.
Yes, because to them, the promise of a reformed, classless society seemed like the most viable path to equality.
But the Marxist route was just one reaction. The Zionist movement was simultaneously gaining incredible momentum.
What?
They were actively brainstorming potential territories for a Jewish state. And what surprised me in the source material is that it wasn't immediately obvious to everyone that this state absolutely had to be in Palestine.
That is vital context for our listeners. Theodor Herzl, who is widely considered the father of modern political Zionism, entertained several non-Palestine alternatives.
Because they were just desperate for a safe haven.
Precisely. Among the serious proposals discussed were establishing a territory in Argentina, creating a nation in Uganda, which is right in the heart of Africa, and even forming a state in El Arish.
That's between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, right?
Correct.
Wait, Uganda, Argentina. Just pause and think about the sheer desperation required to consider uprooting an entire civilization to completely unfamiliar continents.
It really sets the stage for what happens next.
Right. Then the geopolitical earthquake happens. The 1917 Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks seize power, overthrow the Tsarist system, and establish a government.
But if we fast forward just 3 years, the economic situation for Russian Jews is absolutely desperate.
Which brings us to one of the most prominent figures of the revolution. Let's talk about Leon Trotsky.
Trotsky is an incredibly complex figure in this narrative. He was actually born Lev Davidovich Bronstein and was educated in a traditional religious household.
But he distanced himself from that.
Completely. He made no effort to understand or sympathize with the essence of Zionism. When the Bolsheviks created the Jewish section of the Communist Party to bring the Jewish masses into the socialist fold, Trotsky remained completely aloof.
He changed his name and defined himself strictly as an internationalist.
He did. He genuinely believed that the persecution of Jews was merely a symptom of capitalism. Once society was reformed through communism, he thought anti-Semitism would just vanish.
He expected them to just embrace communism and suddenly be free of their historical suffering.
And there is a brilliant historical anecdote from our sources that encapsulates this disconnect. Jacob Mays, who was the chief rabbi of Moscow at the time, managed to secure a meeting with Trotsky.
To ask for help.
Yes. The rabbi pleaded with Trotsky to use his power to intercede on behalf of Jews who were actively being persecuted by local populations.
And Trotsky flatly refused.
He refused. He told the rabbi that he was a communist and did not consider himself Jewish.
And Rabbi Mays' reply to that refusal is just legendary. He looked right at him and said, "I know, the Trotskys make the revolutions and the Bronsteins pay the bill."
It is a devastatingly sharp response. The rabbi was reminding this powerful militant of his abandoned identity.
Highlighting the tragic irony.
Exactly. While ideological leaders like Trotsky engineered grand societal upheavals from comfortable offices, the ordinary Jewish people were the ones left to suffer the violent consequences in the streets.
That interaction perfectly illustrates the communist leadership's broader struggle with what they called the Jewish question.
They realized they had to do something practical.
Right, so they initially tried to settle Jewish populations in agricultural areas across the country, specifically in Ukraine and the Crimea. But the source notes those initiatives were derailed.
They failed because of fierce resistance from the local populations and leaders in Ukraine and the Crimea. They simply did not want these new settlements.
At the same time, the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine was deeply unpopular with the communist leadership.
Deeply unpopular. We can look directly at a historical document produced by the Second Communist International to understand their official stance.
They openly campaigned against it.
Intensely. The document explicitly stated that Zionists intended to establish a state in Palestine to expel the working people from those lands. It argued that Jewish workers there were a tiny minority.
So they painted Zionism as an anti-worker colonial enterprise.
Yes, and that became the dominant image of the movement within Russian revolutionary forces throughout the 1920s and 1930s.
So local settlements in Ukraine are failing, and they despise the Zionist movement. But then, within the Soviet apparatus, perspectives begin to shift slightly.
They do.
The GPU, which was the secret police that would eventually evolve into the KGB, actually begins to view the situation with a degree of sympathy. They start to support the idea that Jews should have territory of their own.
But there was a massive catch. They wanted that territory to be located strictly within the borders of the Soviet Union. What's fascinating here is the underlying motivation during Joseph Stalin's government between 1928 and 1934. The proposal emerged to create a Jewish enclave in Birobidjan.
And for our listeners, Birobidzhan is situated in the extreme Far East, right on the border between the Soviet Union and Manchuria.
Exactly. But you must understand, Stalin's real motive had absolutely nothing to do with preserving Judaism or providing a genuine safe harbor.
Let me push back on that for a second. If his goal wasn't to help them, why go through the massive administrative headache of establishing a specific autonomous region for them? Why not just send random Soviet loyalists?
That is the crucial question. It was entirely strategic, aiming to solve two problems at once. First, Stalin was deeply concerned about that remote region because it was adjacent to Manchuria, which was occupied by a highly expansionist Japanese empire.
So he desperately needed a human buffer zone.
Right. And second, he still had to solve the internal Jewish question and neutralize the appeal of Zionism.
Ah, so it was a geopolitical two birds, one stone situation.
Precisely. By sending the Jewish population to the Far East, he aimed to create a Soviet Jewish peasant proletariat. He wanted them to forge a new proletarian culture stripped of all Zionist national aspirations.
Creating loyal border guards masquerading as an autonomous cultural enclave.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, especially when you look at the sheer physical scale of the territory they designated. Birobidjan covered 34,000 square kilometers.
It was massive.
To put that abstract number into perspective for you, that is roughly the size of the entire country of Belgium. It is significantly larger than the modern state of Israel, which covers about 22,000 square kilometers.
So they gave them a huge tract of land.
But the size is exactly where the advantages ended, right? Because the environment was brutally unforgiving.
Unforgiving is an understatement. The geography was incredibly harsh. It is true that the region was endowed with rich natural resources. The survey showed abundant deposits of coal, iron, copper, and gold.
But the living conditions were exceedingly difficult.
We're talking about implacable, freezing Siberian winters and seemingly permanent rain and rud during the warmer months.
And the infrastructure required to actually mine those resources or even just sustain a population was practically non-existent.
Yet, despite these adverse conditions, the Central Executive Committee of the Soviets officially declared Birobidjan open for Jewish colonization.
And the cultural parameters they set up were quite bizarre compared to the Zionist movement happening in Palestine at the exact same time.
Very different.
In Palestine, there was this massive organic effort to revive Hebrew as a living spoken language. But in Birobidjan, the Soviet authorities actively sidelined Hebrew.
They did.
Instead, Yiddish was made the mandatory official language. Why force Yiddish?
That language mandate was a highly calculated ideological choice. It was cultural engineering. Yiddish was considered the secular language of the Jewish working class in Eastern Europe.
Whereas Hebrew was associated with religion and Zionism.
Exactly. Hebrew was deeply tied to religious liturgy, ancient history, and the political Zionist movement. By mandating Yiddish, the state was attempting to engineer a secular socialist identity from the top down.
They wanted the culture without the religion or the historic ties to the Middle East. It sounds like they were building a theatrical set of a Jewish town completely controlled by the state.
That's a very accurate way to describe it.
I read that they allowed a state-sanctioned theater, a bookstore, but when it came to actual religion, they permitted exactly one synagogue for a region the size of Belgium.
Just one. It was a highly sanitized, state-approved version of cultural identity.
So you have this massive, freezing, undeveloped land, and you start sending people there. The official documents reveal that the first year of settlement was an absolute, unmitigated
It
disaster.
was catastrophic.
The colonists were hit by terrible, frequent floods and violent storms.
Okay.
A devastating epidemic swept through the region and completely wiped out all of the livestock they had painstakingly brought with them.
And they quickly discovered that the land was totally unfit for the agricultural plans the government had programmed for them.
It was a logistical nightmare.
But despite these catastrophic failures on the ground, the mere existence of the project, aided by robust Soviet propaganda, managed to generate immense enthusiasm among the Jewish political left around the world.
The numbers are staggering. Between 1928 and 1938, approximately 43,000 domestic Jews migrated to the region from within the Soviet Union.
But perhaps the most surprising demographic is the international arrivals.
Yes, this completely blew my mind. Around 1,400 international leftist idealists actually packed up their lives and traveled to Siberia.
It is hard to fathom today.
Think about that for a second. Imagine leaving your life in the United States or Europe or Latin America and moving to freezing Siberia because a geopolitical brochure convinced you it was a socialist paradise.
We're even talking about people leaving British-controlled Palestine to go to Birobidzhan,
It truly speaks to the desperate hope of the era.
and the immense power of ideological propaganda. These individuals traveled across the globe, genuinely believing they were participating in the historic birth of a socialist Jewish utopia.
In the United States, philanthropic organizations were even founded specifically to financially support this migration. But the reality check must have been brutal.
It was impossible to ignore. They arrived expecting a thriving socialist community and instead found permanent rain, freezing winters, and total agricultural collapse.
So they didn't stay.
No. Shortly after arriving and experiencing these horrific conditions firsthand, the vast majority of these 1,400 international idealists fled. They packed whatever they had left and returned to their countries of origin.
So if the conditions were this horrific and even the international idealists were fleeing, did the Soviet government just abandon the colonists? Did they admit defeat?
Not at all. In fact, they doubled down to legitimize the administration of the region. By 1930, they appointed a man from Belarus named Jacob Levin as the first Communist Party commissioner in Birobidzhan.
They needed to make it look official.
Yes. They also brought in Yosef Lieberberg, who was a distinguished member of the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, naming him the president of the Regional Executive Committee.
Huh.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see the Kremlin reinforcing their geopolitical strategy. In 1934, they officially proclaimed Birobidzhan as the Jewish Autonomous Region.
So this wasn't just an administrative update?
No, it was a loud, formal declaration meant to solidify their strategic defenses against Japanese expansion in Manchuria. The propaganda machine went into overdrive, promoting it internationally as the viable alternative to Palestine.
But that facade crumbled incredibly fast, didn't it? Instead of becoming a thriving center for Jewish culture, Birobidzhan basically became a factory for assimilation and tragedy.
It did. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin's infamous political purges swept through the Soviet Union, and the local population of Birobidzhan was certainly not spared.
The dictator's paranoia reached all the way to the Far East.
The promised incentives for Jewish culture evaporated almost overnight. The mandatory Yiddish schools, which had been the cornerstone of their cultural engineering, were abruptly closed.
The institutions designed to support the struggling farmers were completely dismantled.
And the government's policy of attracting new Jewish settlers was officially suspended.
It's just devastating. The project was a catastrophic historical failure. The infrastructure collapsed, the cultural institutions were purged, and these people were left stranded in an unforgiving landscape.
Stranded and completely isolated.
But what I find most striking about this entire endeavor is how the Soviet leadership ultimately chose to explain this failure. They never acknowledged the impossible geography or their own brutal political purges.
They refused to take any accountability whatsoever.
Which brings us to a fascinating diplomatic moment. Fast forward to 1945. The Second World War is nearing its end, Nazism is on the verge of defeat, and the three major Allied leaders meet at the Yalta Conference.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin.
Right. They are mapping out the post-war world order. During this conference, President Roosevelt directly asks Stalin for his opinion on Zionism.
And Stalin's response to Roosevelt is dripping with historical irony and a complete lack of self-awareness. He said, and I quote, "In principle, I support Zionism. However, it is very difficult to solve this Jewish question. Our experience in Birobidjan failed because Jews prefer to live in big cities."
So what does this all mean? When you look at Stalin's excuse that the project failed simply because the population preferred urban living, it reveals a staggering blind spot.
Absolutely.
He's essentially blaming the victims for the failure of his own impossible, freezing, underfunded buffer zone project.
Exactly. The author's final thesis in our source material points out something profound. Neither Stalin nor his comrades in the Kremlin could ever comprehend why the Jewish people did not flock en masse to the remote borders of Manchuria.
They viewed the situation purely as an administrative puzzle.
It was just a matter of moving demographic puzzle pieces on a map to secure a vulnerable border.
They completely missed the human element.
Utterly. The Kremlin failed to understand that Zionism was not merely a pragmatic desire for random, available land to farm. It wasn't a superficial need for acreage.
It was much deeper than that.
It was a profound, deeply rooted spiritual yearning to return to a historic homeland. It was a connection to the land of Israel that had been sustained through liturgy, culture, and memory over millennia.
You simply cannot manufacture that kind of spiritual and cultural gravity by drawing a line in the Siberian snow and declaring it an autonomous region.
You certainly cannot.
The disconnect between bureaucratic planning and deep human identity is just staggering here. It is a profound lesson in how rigid ideology can completely blind leadership to the actual lived realities of the people they are trying to govern.
For those of you listening who want to investigate the historical, ideological, and political mechanics of this era even further, I highly recommend exploring the bibliography provided in our source material.
Yeah, there are some great resources there.
There are 3 foundational readings that will expand on everything we have unpacked today. First, I recommend Stalin and the Jews by A. Lustiger, published in 2003, which provides a deep dive into the dictator's complex policies.
Excellent.
Second, to truly understand the Soviet ideological framework from the source itself, look at Marxism and the National Question by Joseph Stalin, specifically the 1954 publication in Volume 2 of his works.
Going straight to the primary source.
Exactly. Finally, for a broader academic perspective on the era, seek out The History of the Jews in Russia in recent publications by M. Vishnitzer, published in the Jewish Quarterly Review in 1945.
Those sound like excellent resources for anyone looking to truly master the historical context behind the Birobidjan experiment. It's a piece of history that deserves to be remembered, if only as a cautionary tale.
Absolutely. And this raises an important question for all of us today.
I'm listening.
As we look at the modern world, with all its ongoing conflicts and territorial disputes, how many geopolitical solutions fail right now because governments attempt to solve complex administrative or territorial problems without taking the time to truly understand the deep spiritual, historical, or cultural identity of the people involved?
Thank you very much for having been with us. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe for free to the channel, and from now on, we invite you to follow the next episode.